Nevada, civil rights and ethno-cultural politics. For many years, Nevada has been called the Mississippi of the West, which refers to the racial and ethnic discrimination that took place in Nevada. The Declaration of Rights that forms the first article of the Nevada Constitution states that all men are by nature free and equal and have certain inalienable rights. The man who wrote these words did not believe that these words applied to all men and women. As one of the first acts in 1861, the Nevada Territorial Legislature passed a law that said no black person or mulatto or Indian or Chinese would be allowed to give evidence in court either in favor or against any white person. The legislature also prohibited cohabitation of white persons with Indians, Chinese, and blacks. The breach of this law was punishable by fine or jail time. Chinese immigrants began arriving in Nevada in 1849, so the ethnic Chinese will be the first group we consider in this video. So they began arriving in 1849, and they did so for the same reason that everyone else has come to Nevada, to find wealth in the area's mines. Discrimination and violence began almost immediately. A law was passed prohibiting Chinese from owning land. Chinese miners were targets of frequent violence, and they were driven from mining. Great increases in Chinese population occurred from 1867 to 1869 during the construction of the Central Pacific Railroad across the state. They were willing to work hard for low wages, and despite this, or maybe because of this, they were viewed with hostility by local inhabitants who saw them basically as a threat to their own livelihood. So mining unions acted to exclude Chinese from the unions and thereby prevented them from working in the mining industry, as mines were closed union industry during those days. Also, federal laws, particularly in 1882, 1907, 1921, and 1924, established immigration quotas that were so restrictive that they virtually eliminated legal immigration from China. After 1881, Chinese in Nevada were allowed to give testimony against whites in court. However, this testimony was sometimes ignored. For example, when two elderly Chinese laundrymen were beaten to death in Tonopah's Chinatown, more than 20 Chinese witnesses testified that 5 white men who were standing trial actually committed this crime. But all 5 white men were acquitted. Many anti-Chinese organizations were created in the state. Virginia City, Nevada passed a resolution stating that presence of Chinese in Nevada was an injurious to the welfare of the state and a danger to the Republic, meaning to the United States. Most of Reno's Chinatown, including private homes, were burned to the ground in 1908 by a mob that was acted on the instructions and incitement of local officials. Employment prohibitions against the Chinese were repealed by the state legislature in 1959. In addition, various laws enacted by the federal and state government in the 1960s and 1970s worked to free the Chinese and other minorities from discrimination. The Chinese were not the only Asians who have settled in Nevada. There are also many people from India, Pakistan, Japan, Korea, Thailand, and of course the Philippines. In fact, the Filipinos are the single largest group of Asians in Nevada. Now, the great increase in Asian population in Nevada occurred only starting in the late 20th century. For example, in 1990, there were only 35,000 Asians living in Nevada, which accounted for 2.9% of the population. By 2000, they were 4.5% of the population. By 2009, 6.6% of the population. And by 2014, 8.3% of the population. So they went from just under 3% of the population in 1990 to 8.3% of the population in 2014. So that's an almost threefold increase in terms of the percentage that they make up of the total Nevada's population. The breakdown by different nationality is that the Filipinos are the largest group with about 45% of all Asians, followed by 15% Chinese, 9% Japanese, 8.5% Korean, etc. Now the next group that we consider in this video is African Americans. Fewer than 40 African Americans lived in Las Vegas in 1910. And in fact, in the entire state, there were only 134 as of the census conducted in that year. As of 2014, 9% of the Nevada's population was black. Black population began to rise significantly in Nevada in the 1930s and 1940s because of the construction of the Hoover Dam and later because of the wartime industry. Companies constructing Hoover Dam generally refused to hire black people. In Nevada, segregation existed, and it was done not by state law, but by private business. State law simply permitted segregation, but it did not require it. However, most businesses, particularly big businesses, chose to segregate. Open discrimination existed everywhere in housing, employment, and entertainment. Blacks were relegated to menial jobs. They were also not allowed to eat, drink, gamble, or attend shows in casinos and restaurants. Business owners did not want to offend their white clientele, many of them from California, many of whom were former Southerners who migrated west. Black entertainers like Sammy Davis Jr. and Lena Horne were not allowed to stay in the hotels in which they performed. When the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP, threatened massive demonstrations and sit-ins, Las Vegas Mayor Orrin Gregson announced in 1960 the end of segregation in public accommodations located within city limits. However, as you might know, the Las Vegas Strip is not located within the city limits of Las Vegas, and it remained segregated for a few more years. But of course, in 1964, the Civil Rights Act banned all segregation of facilities that served the public, even if they were private. So 1964, legal segregation ends. In Reno and Carson City, there were also sit-ins and protests and demonstrations. And in 1969, 1970, there were significant race riots in Las Vegas, particularly in the schools. Now, the next group we consider will be Hispanics or Latinos. Now, the Spanish and later Mexicans were actually the first non-native explorers of what is today Nevada. Hispanics began migrating to the state in large numbers in the 1860s, and they work in the mines, in service jobs, and as sheep and cattle ranchers. So in this early period, most of southern Nevada Hispanic population resided in the north. I should say most of Nevada's Hispanic population resided in the north, because obviously that was the region that was developing faster than the south. Hispanic migration into southern Nevada began in the early 20th century with the construction of a railroad line between Los Angeles and Salt Lake City that passed through the Las Vegas Valley. Along with the Chinese, Mexican laborers performed much of the work on this and other railroads that were constructed in the state. The most significant migration of Hispanics, however, began after World War II. Federal investment in the state in the form of capital and military expenditures brought Hispanics to Nevada in large numbers as construction workers and soldiers, and also to fill a number of other occupations. Now, one of the ways in which white homeowners reacted to this in Las Vegas was to create restrictive covenants that prohibited a sale of property in most parts of Las Vegas to anyone other than whites. Thus, Hispanics, just like African Americans, became concentrated in the western part and in the north part of Las Vegas. Virtually all Hispanics residing in Nevada prior to the 1960s were of Mexican descent. That pattern changed somewhat with the communist revolution of Fidel Castro in Cuba. A number of exiles with experience in the gambling industry, which was based in Havana, settled in Nevada to continue in the occupations to which they were already used to. Hispanics from the East Coast, primarily Puerto Ricans, also began to migrate to the state during this period. Now, if you look at Hispanics or Latinos as a percentage of the population, of course, you see a significant increase between 1980 and 2014. Those 35 years or so have seen a significant increase of Hispanics as a percentage of the population. For example, in 1980, there were only 6.8% of the population, 1980. By 2000, they were 20% of the population, and 2014, 27.8% of the population. So clearly, they were the fastest growing group. And of course, what caused that significant migration, right? from Mexico and Central America to the United States. Women in Nevada. Now, why would we consider women a minority group? Remember, if you go back to my civil rights lecture on women and the Constitution, you will note that minority is not defined by numbers. It is defined by political power. So those who have significantly less political power are a minority, and not necessarily because they are a numerical minority. So women have traditionally in the United States been a slight majority, about 51% of the population, because women live longer, they don't die in wars as much as men do. So numerically, women are in fact a majority, although a very slight one. But numerical things do not determine the minority status. Women used to have almost no political power before the 20th century. So women in Nevada could vote only since 1914. And you might also recall that Western states and territories were the first ones to grant women the right to vote. So Nevada was 6 years ahead of the national guarantee of the right to vote, which would come only in 1920. Casinos and bars in Nevada at first fiercely resisted hiring women as dealers and bartenders out of fear that hiring them would simply lead to the overall lower salaries, and this would undercut the men, would undercut their salaries. In 1958, the Las Vegas City Commission prohibited women from being hired as bartenders. Instead, women were more often to be found in the lower-paying jobs of waitresses, cashiers, and keno runners. And today, some would say that it's the opposite, that it is easier for a woman to find a job as a bartender than it is for a man. It was not until 1981 that Las Vegas casinos and unions signed an agreement to end discrimination against women in employment-related matters. Nevada leads the country in the percentage of women who die as a result of domestic violence, approximately 3.44 for 100,000 residents. That's more than twice the national average. It is quite likely that dysfunctions like high rates of drug addiction and alcoholism and gambling and high foreclosure rates contribute to this very disturbing rate of violence against women. Nevada is one of the 15 states that failed to ratify the so-called Equal Rights Amendment in the 1970s. It was very heavily opposed by the LDS Church. So there's been a lot of conservative influence in Nevada, which is so-called traditional conservative influence, which ran contrary to the more liberal strand of women's rights. Some Nevada employers, like the Department of Public Safety, have been plagued by allegations of sexual discrimination. A particularly interesting case was that of Jackie Sandage, who had won the largest award, approximately for $500,000, for being sexually harassed, and she detailed, you can read in this video all the details of her accusations, but she basically accused the Department of Public Safety of hostile environment harassment, that is to say, a pattern of harassment, and she said that the superiors have refused to stop it. In fact, some participated in it, and so she sued, and she won that significant award for $480,000 to be exact. And after her, a number of other women came forward, also filed lawsuits. I don't know the outcome of every lawsuit, but there have been quite a bit against the Department of Public Safety. Now, if you combine the award of $480,000 and over $100,000 a year salary, that's a good chunk of money. And the question then becomes, when you read about all these lawsuits and these significant settlements, is this a good way to settle these problems, to resolve these problems? Clearly, sometimes you have no other remedy but to sue, and it is quite likely that a pattern of lawsuits will in fact make a difference and will bring this to the attention of the agency and the public, and will make significant changes in the department's behavior or in the agency's behavior. However, lawsuits are expensive, and who is on the hook for all this? It's the taxpayers, and the lawsuits enrich lawyers disproportionately. So the question becomes, maybe a better remedy is to prevent lawsuits from arising in the first place. Now, the last on this group on this list is homosexuals. Why are they a minority? Obviously, not just a numerical minority, but traditionally have had fewer political and social rights than majorities. So, some brief history. In 1993, the legislature repealed the anti-sodomy law. In 1995, the legislature added sexual orientation to the state's hate crime laws that increased penalties for crimes committed against an individual due to the person's race, religion, color, nationality, or disability. In other words, in 1995, they added sexual orientation to a list of protected groups. So if you commit a crime against a protected group and the motive for that crime is the hatred of the group, then that's a hate crime and it has enhanced penalties. In 1999, the legislature passed a statute that outlawed employment discrimination based on sexual orientation. In 2003, the legislature unanimously passed a law that allowed hospital patients to designate who their visitors should be. And in 2005, the legislature passed a law declaring its state policy that services provided by private establishments such as casinos, restaurants, movie theaters, hotels, and other places of public accommodation should not be denied to anyone on the basis of sexual orientation. And here you see some references as well. Thank you very much.